Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to chair this workshop on state actors in the present conflict in Syria and Iraq, but also perhaps beyond. We received here allocated a small, relatively small amphitheater. Probably they think that the other subject of the lone wolves or the organization is more sexy. But I can assure you that the state actors are the real players. I mean, the organizations are also clearly very important, but still without the state actors, I think what we see today and what we saw for many years would not exist. We received we decided two strategic decisions, collective decisions. One, not to use Thai, and the second, to reduce our presentations to 15 minutes. So we'll have hopefully more time for discussion, questions, and answers. So we'll stick to the 15 minutes by each presenter. Now, the issue of state actors, in my opinion, is a very old issue. And actually, I see the problem of how state actors have influenced international or global terrorism, how it is called today. In the time it was transnational terrorism, as a result of three phenomena or three developments. The first one was the decision of the Palestinian terrorist organizations of the 60s and the 70s to use the international arena for terrorist activity. The first real international act of terrorism was the decision in July '68 by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine to hijack an Israeli plane to Algiers. And from there, it began to develop in what today we consider to be a global terrorist activity. But actually, the Palestinians were active from Bangkok to South America, and even once or twice in Washington, clearly in all of the Middle East. The second phenomena was exactly the issue of state actors. Practically all the Arab states were supporting this terrorist activity on the international arena. Some of them much more intensively, especially what it was called at that time the radical ones, the Syria, Iraq, Algeria, Libya, but even Egypt until 1974 supported international terrorism of the Palestinians. And this gave them the possibility, first of all, to stage this kind of activities, to recruit the people in the Middle East, to send them, and then to have a safe haven. And also they were financing, by the way, these organizations, and they were also fighting each other. I mean, every country that supported the Palestinians were using them for their own strategic interests, national interests, be it the Iraqis or the Syrians or the Libyans, and as I said, even the Egyptians. So this is the second thing that influenced the development of international terrorism. And the third thing was the fact that European countries, by the way, where most of the terrorist activity was staged by the Palestinians, and even the United States, and the international community did not really react to this kind of activities. People which were involved in the München attacks in the Olympics were freed. I mean, the terrorists were freed after 3 days when a German aircraft was hijacked after the attack, the survivors of this terrorist attack, and practically no trials were staged during the 70s and even the beginning of the 80s. Things began to change only after the first Lebanon war. So this permitted them again to develop this strategy of using international terrorism and to influence also the second wave of terrorism, especially Islamist terrorism. If you look to the Iranian terrorism, for instance, Imad Mughni, the famous strategist of Hezbollah and Iranian terror, began as a operative, or if you want, a member of the 417 of the Fatah, Palestinian movement. The same guy which called Anis Nakash, I don't know who remember them, he was active in France. He also became a specialist for the Iranians. He was a Palestinian, and he even today is used by their propaganda. So this issue of state actors is extremely important. Since then, the Iranian regime used them very, very cleverly. So we'll try today to present several aspects of these actors. First of all, Iran, clearly because it's the really most involved in supporting such activities on a very large scale and globally, but also Pakistan and its activity mainly in the region, Southeast Asia, vis-à-vis India and vis-à-vis Afghanistan, but perhaps again also beyond. And what are considered to be new actors like Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, although I would argue that these also, not Qatar perhaps, but Saudi had a role in the past in supporting such groups. And we have a very, I think, rich panel of experts on these issues, and I hope that it will be of interest to hear them and then to discuss. Now, the first speaker will be Ilan Berman. Mr. Berman is Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. He is an expert on regional security, not only in the Middle East, but also Central Asia and the Russian Federation. He is a leading expert which advised also the United States Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, and he also is involved in advising other foreign policy and national security agency. So Ilan will speak about the global, Iran's global agenda, okay? We'll begin with the global agenda, please.
Thank you. I won't say, I promise. Thank you, Eli. And let me start just with a couple of housekeeping things because I think it's important. So first of all, it's a delight to be here. I've been here several years running now, and it's, I think, a testament to the ICT, but also to the pressing nature of I haven't always talked in Iran, but I often do. And when I do, I like to do it at the ICT because this is sort of the leading forum where we can really discuss the impact on the region. So it's a delight to be back. The second housekeeping agenda is that I have to give a disclaimer. I'm a recovering lawyer by education. So there's some of us here in the room, right? But like Abe in the back. But it compels me to tell you guys that what you're going to hear from me is my opinion, that of my institute, but not of the agencies that I've consulted for, because I've at times neglected to do that, and I see veins throbbing in the front row and all sorts of things. So what you're going to hear is what I hope is an informed outsider perspective, because my institution is outside the government, but we spend a lot of time consulting for it. And the third is what you're going to see, and here we have to tab over, I believe, right? That's not it? Perfect. Let me play. What you're going to see is, we got it? No? Of course not. It's okay. It's coming. It's PowerPoint. I know. Is that I don't have a PhD in PowerPoint. So for those of you that have spent time in Washington, you know that PowerPoint, particularly in the military, is a little bit of a high art form. And things swoop in from the left and sort of fade in from the right. And I have no idea how to do that. So what you're going to see, what's on the screen is mostly me as an absent-minded professor, if it ever comes up. If it doesn't,
seems to not be working.
That's okay. And we're off and running. So there we go. Okay. Yeah.
The internet.
That's good. Okay. Perfect. So what you're going to see is mostly mnemonic devices. Ideally, not so much stuff on the screen that you don't have to pay attention to me, but this is sort of mostly for me. So please bear with me. So the first thing I think you need to think about, and the reason I sort of frame this discussion as Iran's global agenda is because sometimes we tend not to see the forest for the trees. So our discussion over Iran, particularly in the last 2 years, has been almost overwhelmingly focused on the nuclear deal and the permutations thereof and sort of the impact. And we'll end up talking about that because I think it's extremely important. But it's not the end of the story. It's not the sum total of Iran's ambitions. Iran is not a status quo power. Iran is a revisionist power that's seeking to revise the geopolitical balance in the Middle East and also beyond in its favor. So it's useful to zoom out a little bit and take a look at the 30,000 feet approach and take a look at what Iran has been doing. And has been doing, by the way, while it's still sanctions constrained. Because remember, it's still sanctions constrained. The deal is not a done deal yet, although it may be in the near future. So The first, see, little slide. Okay, so the first thing that you need to talk about is you need to talk about comparative sophistication of diplomacy, because I think when we talk to the Iranians, we're at a comparative disadvantage, because in the United States, in Europe, even in Israel, clarity of presentation is actually a net benefit from our political leaders. Our leaders say what they mean, sometimes not so well, but sometimes really well. And one hopes they mean what they say, right? What we strive for is a unity of purpose, where you can unite the diplomatic language with actually what you're going to do. And so, in a perfect world, when you have Western leaders speaking to audiences, both domestic and international, they're giving the same message. That's not true when it comes to Iran. So what we are seeing, and what we've seen over the last 2 years, has been one voice of many that Iran actually speaks in simultaneously. The voice that we're hearing is the voice of pragmatic mercantilism. This is transactional. This is pragmatic. This is embodied by people like current Iranian President Hassan Rouhani, by the Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. This is essentially the sales pitch that Iran is making to the world. And it looks exactly like you would expect. It looks like those snapshots of diplomatic tables in Lausanne, Switzerland, or in Vienna, Austria, where the Iranians look extremely willing to at least sit down and talk and make a deal. On the periphery, right? On an issue that's important to them, but it's not intrinsic to their regime. But at the same time, and this is sort of, we've boiled down our concern with Iran to precisely this line of questioning. But the Iranians are actually talking substantially broader. So while they're talking to us pragmatically, they're speaking in pan-Islamic terms to the broader Middle East. They believe fervently that their regime is the natural ideological inheritor of the Islamic world, that they are actually the rightful inheritors of the mantle of the Prophet Muhammad. And this dates all the way back to Khomeini's belief that when the founding of the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution marked the start of a global caliphate, and it was Iran's duty to, as Khomeini said in 1979, to usher in the dominance of Islam in all the countries of the world, right? This is an expansionist agenda. This isn't a statist agenda. And so it's a message that they're trying to communicate with the international community, particularly with the Muslim world. The third line, the third register, the third voice in which Iran speaks is that of Shiite sectarianism. The Iranian regime sees itself as the vanguard of the so-called Shiite crescent in the Middle East, and as the ideological champion of a beleaguered minority within Islam itself. Right? This is what underpins the ideological competition between Shiite Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia, the jockeying for primacy over the interpretation of the religion of Islam. So you see this manifested, for example, most concretely in Iran's support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, Iran's support for Shiite militias in Iraq, Iran's support for Shiites in Bahrain, Iran's support for the Houthi rebels in Yemen, right? So the list goes on. But this is sort of the natural expression of Iran's attempt to emerge, successfully I think, as the champion of Shiite sectarian interests. And the fourth criterion, and this is I think the most interesting, is that while Iran is having those conversations, it's talking to us about arms control, it's talking to the Shiites about Shiite empowerment, it's talking to the Muslim world about legitimacy, it's talking to the third world, the non-Muslim world, about populist, mostly socialist ideas. So the greatest example of this was that September 2012 speech that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad gave before the UN General Assembly. It's the one that was made famous because of the reporting of him saying how, he saw that everybody stood wrapped for half an hour and that there was a halo around him, and he saw the prophet, right? And we all sort of scoffed because we thought that was a little bit silly, but the message that he gave was deadly serious, because if you look at the text of the speech, he's not talking to us. He's not even talking to Europe. He's talking to Latin America. He's talking to Africa. And the message that he's sending is that the existing world order dominated by the US and Europe hasn't really worked out so well for all of us. And we should band together to create an opposite pole. Right? And this message has resonated very well among the countries of Africa. It's also resonated very well among the countries of Latin America. Right? So this gets you into a discussion of what Iran has tried to do over the last several years. And remember, overlaying all of this is the fact that Iran is pursuing this global agenda while it's still resource constrained, right? So you can expect these to accelerate over time. So in the early going, you saw an Iran that was publicly trying to intellectually harness the currents of the Arab Spring. So you had Iranian officials talk about the fact that the Arab Spring was a belated outgrowth of Khomeini's revolution, how Iran was destined to be the champion of the Arab Spring currents. And in putting this into practice, you saw Iran attempt to improve relations with the caretaker government in Egypt, and after that, to mend fences with the Muslim Brotherhood. And that clearly wasn't successful, right? We've seen a reversal of fortune there. Same holds true in Bahrain, where an early effort on the part of the Iranians was to attempt to stimulate an uprising among Bahrain Shia against the Sunni al-Khalifa family, right? In fact, that was considered to be such a grave threat that it prompted the intervention of a force of over 1,000 soldiers from a collective GCC deployment. So clearly, the early efforts weren't so successful, but the later ones were. And so what you've seen in Yemen has been almost wholly a product of Iranian sponsorship. So Yemen is, for those of you that study it, you understand that Yemen is a security nightmare in the sense that it has overlapping conflict zones. It has a separatist, secessionist movement in the south. It has al-Qaeda, and it has a Shiite insurgency in the north. But the Shiite insurgency has come to dominate those other two poles in large part, because of Iranian sponsorship and the amount of money valued in the billions of dollars that Iran has sunk into that insurgency to date. And it was successful. In the fall, the offensive began in the fall and it concluded in the spring. What you've seen is an Iranian-sponsored Shiite overthrow of the government, of the al-Hadi government in Sana'a. And so now Iran effectively is a power broker, if not in de facto control, over Yemeni politics. And for those of you that study energy politics, you understand that Iran in control of not one but two energy choke points, right, because they already sit on top of the Strait of Hormuz, and now they control the Bab al-Mandab as well, I think should be a cause for concern, particularly for countries like Egypt. The second sort of big ticket effort on the part of the Iranians is the emergence of Iran as perhaps the key prong that has prolonged the longevity of the Assad regime. Right? The U.S. government, the White House in particular, has said publicly that they estimate that the aid that Iran provides annually to the Assad regime, to number on the order of $6 billion a year. There are other estimates, including one that just came out from the Congressional Research Service, that actually puts that number significantly higher. But that is a tremendous amount of resources for an Iran which is buffeted by economic instability to be sinking in the external sponsorship of a fellow sort of insurgent regime. So in the Middle East, what you see is Iran attempting to tip the scales, or at least to preserve the status quo in places where the status quo favors it, in places like Syria. In Asia, what you see is a very different dynamic. In Asia, you have essentially three poles of support. The first is China. China is, for those of you that have studied sanctions for a long time, you, I think, understand well that the idea of a sanctions regime against Iran, the conversation begins and ends with China. We can talk about Europe, we can talk about other things, but the reality is that China, over the last several years, while sanctions were truly biting, emerged as the economic lifeline of the Iranian regime. 60% of Iran's sanctions-constrained oil sales went to China, and moreover, that number over the last year has risen dramatically because under the auspices of the negotiations with the international community, the Obama administration has suspended application of CISADA, the 2010 Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act. The reason that's important is because that legislation had provisions in it that said that the 10 identified main consumers of Iranian energy had to certify twice a year that they were drawing down their consumption of Iranian oil. And the certification, if it was not certified, theoretically that would activate sanctions. Well, that piece of legislation has been suspended while the talks were ongoing, and it's now, its future is uncertain now, sort of with the passage of this JCPOA, or the imminent passage of the JCPOA, which means that if you're Chinese, it's a good time to buy Iranian oil. And that's precisely what the U.S. officials who are resident in Beijing are seeing. I was there last summer, and they were saying that as soon as the negotiations began, you saw an uptick of up to 50% in terms of volume of oil flowing monthly from Iran to China, because there were no penalties that attached to this type of commerce. And there's also very few penalties that attach to the second type of commerce that you see Iran engaging in Asia, which is the strategic partnership that they forged with the North Koreans. So we all understand the North Koreans are barely a functioning regime, insular, hermit kingdom, sort of world's last remaining Stalinist state, but a very useful partner for Iran. I would argue strategically more important even than China, because they are very intimately involved with the development of Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. So if you go back and just look at the open source reporting, you see telltale signs of Iranians being present at the last 2 of Iran's 3 ballistic missile tests, and at the last 2 Iranian nuclear tests. And that gets you into sort of an understanding that what Iran is building, that we're concerned about, it's not really an Iranian enterprise. It's more and more an international enterprise. So I just got the hook, so it's going to be 3 minutes. So let me zip forward really quickly. I had a lot more, but that's okay. That's okay. It's all right. All right. So this is where the money is, I think, right? So let's talk for a few minutes about the JCP. Now 2 minutes. The JCPOA and its impact on Iran. So first of all, I think it's necessary for all of you to understand the scope of sanctions in context, right? So I work for a nonprofit. A lot of my colleagues do as well. I don't know about them. I don't know what $100 billion looks like. And I don't know what $150 billion looks like. But it's such a large sum that it's actually very hard to put in proper context. So let me try to sort of crystallize this for you. Iran's annual GDP last year was $415 billion. So what you're talking about is sanctions relief commensurate with a quarter or more of Iran's national economy. So what this would look like in comparative perspective would be, so Germany's economy is $3.8 trillion. It would be like a $900 billion infusion into the German economy. Israel's economy is $37 billion. It would be like a $9 billion infusion into the Israeli economy. And America's economy is $16.7 trillion. It would be like America getting a cash gift over the span of 8 to 12 months of $4.4 trillion. So just think about that for a second.
I'll take it.
Yeah, right. As would I. And you know what I would do with it? Everything. So the Obama administration has made the point that most of this money will be used for domestic reconstruction. But I think that misses the point. As an American, if I was an American official and I was responsible for receiving this sort of money, if I got sanctions relief of this scope, I would use it for everything. I would use it for domestic reconstruction. I would use it for stabilization of the economy, but I would also use it for other things, like it's specifically the types of things that you see the Iranians beginning to do already. So just as an aside, on June 30th, the Islamic Republic passed its 6th development plan. That's what they call it publicly. The Supreme Leader announced it at Friday prayers publicly in Tehran. This is a development plan that envisions the expansion of Iran's military budget by a third or more. Right? So they're going up to about $20 billion. I've seen some estimates that go up to $30 billion, right? This is all done in anticipation of the sanctions relief that they will receive, right? And by the way, while the practical effects on Iranian military capabilities won't be seen for some time, right? So it takes time to buy planes, it takes time to buy boats and sort of to train soldiers. The political effects that everyone will see that Iran is strengthening militarily are going to be visible immediately. And the same holds true for Iran's proxies. So remember all the way back, right, 10 minutes ago, talking about Shiite sectarianism. What you see is a potentially lethal trickle-down effect for Iran's terrorist proxies, groups like Hezbollah, groups like Shiite militias in Iraq. And what we know, we don't know exactly how much Iran will give them, but we do have a general sense of how much it's giving them now. There was a report that was done by the Congressional Research Service. It was commissioned by Senator Mark Kirk from Illinois. It was published last week. and it was reported on in the American press about how the estimate, the ballpark estimate from the open source material is that Iran spends somewhere between $3.6 billion and $16 billion annually on terror financing, right? That's a huge spread, but it also incorporates aid to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. It incorporates that $6 billion we talked about aid to Syria. But it's a tremendous amount of money, and it's particularly a tremendous amount of money when you think about the fact that this is support that's coming at a time when Iran is struggling with a devalued national currency, with runaway inflation, right? So all of this is likely to increase and to accelerate as Iran's economy stabilizes. It may not happen today, it may not happen tomorrow, but this is the near-term projection of what we're looking at. And that leads us to, I don't know, now I have 0 minutes. So last thought. So this leads us to reactions. And it's necessary to understand, because we Americans tend to have this sense that we are part of an exclusive two-way conversation. We're having a conversation with Iran about their nuclear program. They're having a conversation with us. And what they give us doesn't have any ancillary effects. But the reality is that everyone in Israel and everyone in the region is bracing for an invigorated Iran. And what that's going to look like over the next several years is going to, I think, dramatically and adversely affect the security not only of the state of Israel, but also of Iran's neighbors. So you have the potential for some very troubling trend lines to emerge, ranging from increased proliferation to increased terror activity to increased Sunni sponsorship of jihadism, because after all, we know that the tried and true method of countering Iranian influence in places like Iraq by the Saudis, by the Qataris, which my colleagues will talk about, has been to double down on the sponsorship of Sunni jihadist groups, right? So not a pretty picture, but it also is a telling reminder and a timely reminder, I think, of the fact that diplomacy has consequences. And this is where the magnitude of the debate that is now going on in Congress is really going. This is what the debate is really about. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan, also to be in time. One comment about what you said about the third world populism of Iranians. By the way, in Asia, in Europe, and in Latin America, the leftist radical groups and even the, if you want, mainstream leftist parties and groups see Iran as a very supporter of such kind of movements, while inside Iran, clearly there's a huge repression. First of all, of the leftist elements, of the students, like in 1999, hundreds of students were assassinated, and of union workers. So there is a clear kind of paradox of the vision of Iran as a progressive, supportive of third world movements, but actually it's a very repressive regime. Now we'll narrow the presentation to the issue of Hezbollah as the vanguard of Iran's emerging foreign legion. And we'll have Dr. Matt Levitt, which is a former Wexler Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy in Washington. He directs the Institute's Stein program on counterterrorism intelligence. Previously, he has served as Senior Executive Service at the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the United States Department of the Treasury, and he was also an FBI counterterrorism analyst, so he has a very large knowledge about, as a practitioner and also of academic on this issue. And he authored the widely published Hezbollah book, Hezbollah, the Global Footprint of Lebanon's Party of God. Please, Matt.
They got a fingerprint too. It's okay. Good afternoon. First of all, I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues, and especially one chaired by you, Ellie. Ellie and I go way back now. We brought Ellie as a visiting fellow to the Washington Institute years ago, and he's someone who actually knows a thing or two about Hezbollah, was writing about it long before others, and wrote a monograph for the Washington Institute on Hezbollah. And so it's a pleasure to be here. It's a nice flow to follow Ilan on this, because he set me up real nicely. I would argue that it's not just an issue of Shiite sectarian interests for Iran. Of course it is. It's not just an issue of regional dominance. which it is, it's also an issue of the pursuit of foreign interests by other means. And for Iran, pursuing its foreign interests through violent means no less and no more legitimate or attractive as any other means of pursuing its interests. And it's also not just a factor with the Iran deal of the trickle-down effect for its proxies, which is definitely the case. I argue that something more fundamental is already happening. It's not just that Iran's proxies will have more freedom of operation, will have more money to operate with, will get more weapons, etc. It's that on top of that, that'll happen. But on top of that, I think we are seeing today, though few are paying attention to it, the emergence of a Shiite foreign legion. That while we are all, for the obvious reasons, very focused and fixated on the Sunni jihadist threat and the foreign terrorist fighters that are flowing from the West and may come back to the West or who never even leave the West, that there are in fact just about as many Shia foreign fighters, many of them not traveling quite as long a distance, many of them from nearby countries, but some from Africa, some from Afghanistan, Pakistan, from the West, who are also foreign fighters in this conflict. And I think that this is not by happenstance. I think that Iran is taking this opportunity, using Lebanese Hezbollah as its vanguard, its first among equals in its proxy bench, to create this foreign legion. The war in Syria, I think, is clearly and dramatically changed Hezbollah. Whereas it was once limited to jockeying for political power in Lebanon and fighting Israel, it is now, as a group, as a proxy, as the head of this foreign legion, a regional player. When Hezbollah is engaged in activities in Syria, that has something to do with Lebanon. They don't want to lose the land bridge to Iran, but it has not only to do with Lebanon. When Hezbollah is engaged in activities in Iraq, in Yemen, in the Gulf, that has nothing to do with Lebanon. There is, by the way, a historical precedent for Iran using various Shia fellow travelers and using them together to target its enemies. Few people have paid attention to the fact that in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, there were Iraqi Shia militants, Badr organization, there were Lebanese Hezbollah elements and others who came together to carry out attacks on behalf of Iran in places like Germany, in France, and perhaps most famously in Kuwait. The Dawa 17, called that because there were more Iraqi Dawa operatives, but at least two very important Lebanese Hezbollah operatives, including Mustafa Badruddin, who now heads Hezbollah's terrorist wing and heads its branch in Syria, was one of the people arrested in Kuwait, working together, Lebanese and Iraqi Shia both, not for anything having to do with Lebanese interests, but solely because of Iranian interests in contesting the reflagging of oil tankers, contesting French or German weapons support to Iraq during the war, etc. I think the strongest indication, if you get into the weeds, which is where I like to be on this, of Hezbollah's transformation is structural. So since 2013, for 2 years now, the group has added 2 new commands to its structure. The first is on the Lebanese-Syrian border, and that we've known about for some time. The second is within Syria itself, adding to the existing bases in southern and eastern Lebanon within Lebanon. And this is a startling reorganization for a group that's existed for a long time without this kind of massive structural change. I think this signifies a lot about where it is and where it's going. And in establishing these 2 new commands, one on the border with Syria, not just in the east, but on the border, and the other in Syria, Hezbollah has transferred key personnel from its traditionally paramount southern command, focused on Israel, to its Lebanese-Syria border and Syria commands. And perhaps most tellingly is the fact that Mustafa Badruddin himself, who, as we said, is the head of Hezbollah's terrorist operations, has been serving since 2012 as the head of Hezbollah's military activities in Syria and now heads the group's Syrian command there. No one else has been tasked to take over his role as the head of the Islamic Jihad organization, the terrorist wing. He double hats. That demonstrates how important he is and how important the Syrian command is that he's been put in this position. Now, there are other people as well that did signify just how important this command is to Hezbollah. This is not something that's being left to military or terrorist planners alone. There is, in fact, no distinction between the various wings of groups like Hamas or Hezbollah. And maybe the greatest proof, as the Treasury revealed in a terrorist designation not so long ago, declassifying information and revealing that Hassan Nasrallah himself, the political leader of Hezbollah, the Secretary General of the organization, has personally been directing the group's activities in Syria since at least September 2011, when he reportedly began holding weekly, it's not clear if they were always, but at least sometimes weekly meetings with Assad face-to-face in Damascus to coordinate Hezbollah's contributions to the country's civil war and the defense of the organization. Now, joining the fight in Syria has not come without risks, in particular suffering some serious personnel losses. Some famous people, Hassan al-Akis, Fawzi Ayyub, and other people that names we didn't recognize. But as of the second half of 2015, we understand that Hezbollah was suffering between 60 to 80 casualties a week. And that's a significant amount of casualties for a group the size of Hezbollah. As it deepens its footprint, as it deepens its investment in Syria, Hezbollah continues to aid Shiite militias elsewhere, in particular in Iraq, sending small numbers of skilled trainers to fight the Islamic State, but more importantly, to defend Shiite shrines and the Shia-dominant regime there. In fact, Hezbollah is so invested in Iraq that it has invested in commercial front organizations to support its operations in Iraq. And there are a variety of examples. I could bore you with the names of the operatives and the names of the front organizations. But the point is, this is long-term investment. You don't set up businesses and invest people and resources like this if you don't intend to be there for quite some time. And in Iraq, Hezbollah has dispatched only a small number of people, but an even smaller number of people in Yemen. And that should not be an indicator to you that it's not taking this seriously, because again, the people, the caliber of the people that they're sending is extremely impressive. The prominence of these operatives indicates just how committed they are to things like Iraq and Yemen. For example, in Yemen for quite some time, they've had Khalil Harb, designated by the United States, also longtime head of Hezbollah's Unit 1800, which was dedicated to supporting Palestinian terrorist groups and engaging in direct operations, Hezbollah operations targeting Israel. He graduated from that to regional activities, including overseeing Hezbollah's cell in Egypt, which you may recall reading about a couple of years ago. And then from there to Yemen. Khalil Harb is a very senior individual. But perhaps most telling is the story of Abu Ali Tabatabai. Some of you might have read about Tabatabai when there was the last January, the reported Israeli Air Force strike across the border into the Syrian Golan, targeting an Iranian general and Jihad Mughniya, Imad Mughniya's son. And there were reports that Tabatabai was killed in that raid. He was not. Tabatabai was reassigned from southern Lebanon. He had been in Syria. Tabatabai is one of the most senior Special Operation Forces commanders Hezbollah has. Very, very highly trained. Brought most of his special operatives with him from the southern command in southern Lebanon to Syria, which is telling in its own right. But then he was moved to Yemen. When you send someone like Tabatabai next to someone like Mustafa Badruddin, there's maybe no one of a caliber more important than Tabatabai. When you send someone like that to Yemen, that is telling. Now, there are lots of other stories out there of things that have been happening. You have to take with a couple of grains of salt when the Bahrainis talk, because there's a little bit of crying wolf, although there is also plenty of fire where there is smoke. But the recent example of the Iranian and Hezbollah cell in Kuwait is absolutely the real deal and tells and shows the kind of investment that Iran is doing in the region where it's trying to flex its muscles, without question. There's something else that we need to take into account in all of this, especially in Syria, but also Iraq and Kuwait, where all of this activity is happening very much in coordination with Iran. And that is that Hezbollah's intimate cooperation in these fields of battle with Iran's Quds Force, in particular in Syria, but in the other areas as well, is drawing Hezbollah, at least the Hezbollah militants, the Badruddins of the world, the Tabtabais of the world, into even closer Tehran orbit, deepening the region's ongoing conflicts. In fact, there are even reports that this is creating tension within Hezbollah, that perhaps Nasrallah is giving overall direction to these guys in Syria, but then tells them generally do X, and they go to do X, and maybe, according to some reports, Quds Force says, actually, you should do Y, and then they do Y. And to the extent that very dangerous people are even more closely aligned with Iran, we have even greater problems. And this is to the extent that a Hezbollah commander, anonymous because he was interviewed by the newspapers, I think it was in the Financial Times last May, said, look, and this is a quote, "We should not be called the party of God. We're not a party now. We're international. We're in Syria. We're in Palestine. We're in Iraq, and we're in Yemen. We are wherever the oppressed need us. Hezbollah is the school where every freedom-seeking man wants to learn." Now, there are other stories we could talk about. Iran's very hands-on role, Quds Force generals on the ground in the Golan Heights. But the last thing I'd like to make in the 90 seconds I have left is this. This is not just a severe and immediate, and also very much long-term, problem for those of you who live in the region, or for those of us who have interests and allies and friends in the region, because Hezbollah has been on a tear since 2008 for different reasons, to be sure, avenging Mughniya, playing its role in Iran's shadow war with the West over its nuclear program, in carrying out attacks abroad. And for those who think that that has run its course, I've got other news for you. The past 3 plots alone demonstrate the international breadth of these operations. In Thailand, for the 3rd time in recent years, in Peru, where the operative had recently married a dual Peruvian-American citizen. His wife had been spending time at home in the United States while he was plotting things in Peru. That kind of got America's attention. And most recently, and perhaps most disturbingly, a new, second, very serious plot in Cyprus, in which a massive amount of explosives was found, which we believe was being used as a transshipment point in Cyprus to send these explosives in small packages elsewhere, almost certainly in Europe, for other operations abroad. And again, in case it's not yet clear just how international the scope is, and to underscore Ilan's point about the strange roles being played by countries like China, though it pains me to agree with you. Some of these weapons, some of these explosives that are being shipped around the world are reportedly being shipped, again, by Hezbollah front companies, deep cover front companies, in places like Abu Dhabi and in China. And so when Iran, while it's negotiating a nuclear deal, while it's meeting with people in Geneva and presenting the face of a reliable partner, and through this negotiation being legitimized, whether you're for the deal or against the deal, that's a fact. Iran is being presented today as a legitimate partner. These are some of the things it is doing in its own backyard, further afield in the region, and around the world. Sleep well tonight.
several times, I think you use, but also others use the word proxy for Hezbollah. I think that Hezbollah is more than a proxy. I see Hezbollah as a kind of a symbiotic relationship, especially at the leadership level, between Hezbollah and the Iranian regime. If we look to Hezbollah today, it is the real army of Iran on the issue of ground forces and missiles against Israel and against Syria. So I think that although there are people that think that Nasrallah is more or less influenced by the Lebanese politics, it is influenced. But on the very high ideological and strategic level, I think that Hezbollah should be seen as a part of the Iranian regime. And I think that perhaps you'll discuss during the time that we have for discussion of this issue. Now, we will pass now to Pakistan. Pakistan was never on the list of terrorist sponsors in the United States. Actually, it was one of the main strategic allies in Asia, especially since the war in Afghanistan, the first war in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And even then, when there were some kind of crisis in the relationship on the issue of the nuclear armament and also on the issue of support to Al-Qaeda, and not by chance bin Laden was killed inside Pakistan near a college of the Pakistani army. But clearly, I think every expert on Pakistan knows that Pakistan is one of the countries, or especially their military and especially their intelligence service, which supported terrorist organizations not only against the Soviets and not only against India, but more and more organizations which were active in the region, in Southeast Asia, and perhaps became a threat, internal threat, a major internal threat to the Pakistani regime itself. So to discuss the Pakistan support to terrorism against India, we have today Major General Ashok Mehta. He is a former general officer commanding Indian peacekeeping forces in Sri Lanka. He is a founder of the Defense Planning Staff, and he is involved in a number of dialogues and peace processes, including India-Pakistan, India-Sri Lanka, India-Nepal, and a trilateral, I'd say probably general, track 2. No? It's kind of track 2, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. He has written a number of papers on internal security that deal with combating India's threats with terrorism, left-wing extremism, and insurgency. General, we have the honor to hear you.
Matt, what was that last joke you cracked? Everybody
well
laughed.
tonight.
What?
Sleep well tonight.
Yeah, sleep well. Well, I don't have a joke. But when I was at the academy, the instructor would come around this time and tell the cadets that, look, fellows, please don't sleep. And then he would say, well, if you have to sleep, don't snore. Because you'll wake up your neighbor. Now, what you've heard just now from my friends, esteemed friends, is peanuts compared to what I'm going to tell you about Pakistan. I'm going to tell you a story about a country called Pakistan, how, as the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, has not been declared a terrorist state, despite its distinction of filling up the Hall of Fame with its notoriety. First, it has the distinction of creating a non-state terrorist organization into a state entity. We don't have to think very hard. The Taliban came to power in Afghanistan with the help of Pakistan ISI, and even more remarkably, they were able to retrieve their assets after the US invaded Afghanistan with the help of the Americans, bring back their terrorist assets to be used again. Number two, they harbor, as we speak, 36 terrorist organizations, at least 4 on the UN-US proscribed list. There are 60 banned groups, terrorist groups, 5,400 terrorists held in detention, and nearly 100 on death row. Third, it is responsible for the killing of US soldiers in Afghanistan, for which the Americans pay the Pakistanis. 3 out of the 5 most wanted, and one was just mentioned by Ili, 3 of the 5 most wanted on the US counter-terrorist list lived or live in Pakistan. Mullah Umar of the Afghan Taliban, Ayman Zawahiri of Al-Qaeda, and of course we all know Osama bin Laden. 54 Indian fugitives are in Pakistan. We caught 2 live Pakistanis just last month in Kashmir. 8 out of every 10 terrorist attacks internationally have had some links with Pakistan. Pakistan has raised country-specific terrorist groups against all its neighbors. Iran, Afghanistan, and India. And they are perhaps the only country which classify their terrorists into good terrorists and bad terrorists. So didn't I say this is peanuts compared to what you heard? Pakistan has used terrorism as an instrument of its foreign policy, finessed with deniability. Its pretext is that these non-state actors are not under its control. Israelis lose their sleep over Iran, which does not have a bomb. Not with Pakistan, which does. So think. Now, my presentation is going to be, considering the time constraints, with a background, a strategic framework, a little bit about the ISI, the cross-border terrorism in Kashmir, and Pakistan's phony war on terrorism, testimonials on ISI-sponsored terrorism, and some recommendations. And you'll ask me, how the hell am I going to do this in the next 12 minutes? I bet it's a challenge. Now, India and Pakistan, and just as a little background, because you guys are, maybe you go on a holiday to India, but not to Pakistan. India and Pakistan are from the same womb. They were partitioned in 1947 on religious lines. Muslim Pakistan, Hindu predominant, but secular India. There are more Muslims in India than there are in Pakistan. In fact, there are more Muslims. The second largest population of Muslims is in India after Indonesia. British, well, I don't have to talk to an Israeli audience about sowing seeds of discord. What the British did, they created the Kashmir problem. Subsequently, Pakistan Army waged and after they created Kashmir, the Pakistanis sent their terrorists, 1947, with their regular army. So the nexus between the regular army and the terrorists was made while at the time of their inception. Subsequently, Pakistan Army waged conventional war supported by non-state terrorists in 65, 1971, 1999. Its intelligence arm, the Inter-Services Intelligence, was the key player in these conflicts. The ISI nurtured terrorist groups Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba attacked India's parliament in 2001 and Mumbai in 2008, in which Americans and Israelis were killed, which created an international outrage. A war was averted when Pakistan's military ruler, General Pervez Musharraf, gave an unequivocal assurance to India, conveyed by the United States, and this was what he pledged, to end terrorism permanently, visibly, irreversibly, and to the satisfaction of India. That pledge was repeated by Pakistan at least twice, in vain. It was therefore quite rightly recognized as the epicenter of international terrorism and the breeding ground of radical Islam. The terrorist groups nurtured eventually are hitting back Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis tell you in a friendly manner, our pets are starting to bite us. Pakistanis admit. Now, the sponsors of terrorism have become the victims of their own terrorism. What is the strategic framework? Well, Pakistan Army, or Pakistan itself, is known by 3 A's. And the 3 A's are Army, America, and Allah. About Pakistan Army, it is said that while some states have an army, Pakistan Army has a state. It has the deep state as well, which is the ISI, which I just talked about. Pakistan Army considers itself the custodian of core values, sovereignty, and identity. India has been painted as an existential threat, not terrorism, not sectarianism, not religious extremism, which are eating the innards of that country. Parity and strategic equivalence with India are their strategic objectives. Kashmir is used to embed the idea of Pakistan that if India were not pressed there covertly, its conventional military superiority over Pakistan would be overwhelming. So its strategy of bleeding India through 1,000 cuts has multiple strands, not the least creating instability and communal discord. Pakistan Army is waging an ideological war linked to its Quranic concept of war. That's a famous book by Brigadier S.K. Malik, which every Pakistani army officer has to read. Its central theme is to strike terror in the hearts of the enemy, India. And finally, Pakistan Army's 2 crown jewels, the nuclear bomb and the ISI, are both India-centric. And so, the proxy war or the cross-border terrorism are fine-tuned under the nuclear umbrella. Pakistan, therefore, is an imperfect military democracy. The ISI is a military organization like the DIA. CIA regards, and they're extremely good friends. CIA, as somebody mentioned a short while ago, they collaborated the first Afghan war. CIA regards ISI as one of the most sophisticated developing world's intelligence agencies. It is virtually an independent power center. There is sometimes a struggle between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Army Staff on its control, which the PM loses most of the time, that is the Prime Minister loses most of the time, as the military has ruled Pakistan directly or indirectly throughout its existence. Elaborate organization, 5,000 personnel, political wing, external 1, external 2, and its key activities, which I will skip, but mention that its key role in Afghanistan, which my friend Jonathan Paris will be talking about, so I'll skip all this, but mention just one fact, that the ISI has developed this sophisticated apparatus of intelligence encirclement of India. So like Israel is encircled with a panoply of enemies, so is India. They have used Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives as bases from where to encircle India and to spread discord and terrorism. Role in Pakistani domestic politics. The ISI political cell job is to ensure that the civilian leadership poses no threat to the military leadership. Somebody said, and his name is Ghulam Ahmed Bailur, he is a politician from the Awami National Party. He said, and I quote, ISI is the real power in the country. So how does Pakistan wage this cross-border terrorism? It's created these strategic assets, the terrorist organizations against India, and it uses these terrorist groups initially in Kashmir and subsequently in the rest of India. In Kashmir, there are three activities that are going on today. One is, people do not realize this, that nowhere else in the world is there a border. Since 1947, when you can hear firing take place, infiltration takes place on a regular basis, and attacks take place on a regular basis. So nowhere else in the world. This activity, all this activity is supported by the Pakistan Army, the ISI, and this ensures, as far as Pakistan is concerned, that the Kashmir issue is kept alive. It keeps alive the Pakistan Army's institutional interests to make itself as to ensure that its primacy in society, in Pakistan society, remains, that India remains the enemy and Pakistan remains the symptom of that ideological war that is being waged. The groups that are used in this violence are Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Hizbul Mujahideen, Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front, and these are the main groups. Pakistan maintains a minimum of 300 to 500 terrorists inside Kashmir. Through this infiltration, through the firing, through attacks on the post, it is critical for Pakistan that this support to terrorists is given to keep the Kashmir issue alive and to keep India at the heart of the problem. There are 17 camps which are being maintained by the ISI, which at any time will have at least 200 to 300 terrorists ready to cross over at any given time. Now, Pakistan's phony war on terrorism, and I have just a little more to say. Pakistan, why do I call this phony war? Because Pakistanis do not fight counterinsurgency the way we fight counterinsurgency. The last operation was Zarb-e-Azb. See Christine Fair, she is an American. She called it Zarb-e-Bakwas. Bakwas means nonsense. Because before the Pakistanis launched this operation, there are loud hailers, leaflets dropped, people are warned, people return, there is artillery fire, there are aircraft, there are helicopter gunships. So all the terrorists disperse. Any good a terrorist will know when to leave and where to go. And so they allow the good terrorists, they don't touch the good terrorists here, Haqqanis. They won't touch because they use them in Afghanistan. They will touch the bad terrorists, that is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. When the Indian Army carries out operations, military operations, we do not. Never in the history of counterinsurgency has the Indian Army used the Air Force except once. No helicopter gunships, no artillery. because of, as you appreciate very well, human rights considerations, because the people you are fighting with are your own. But anyway, the point I want to make is that this distinction between good and bad is meticulously kept by the Pakistan army, so that those strategic assets that they use against Afghanistan are not touched. And they are given early warning and they are allowed to disperse. Now, this is the most interesting part of my presentation, and these are the testimonials on Pakistan's great performance. All key persona in these testimonials are the Director General of the ISI. When Osama bin Laden was caught 2 years or 3 years ago in Abbottabad, next to the Kakul Military Academy, one of the former DGISIs, General Asad Durrani, went on BBC and he had the gall to say the following: "We kept Osama bin Laden in order to see whether we could get something from Barack Obama." And you can check with BBC. In 1993, Shuja Nawaz, who's a brother of a former army chief, and he's a Pakistan author, he lives in the United States, works for a think tank, the Foreign Council, yeah. He wrote that threats to declare Pakistan state sponsor of terrorism forced Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to sack the hand-picked ISI chief, Lieutenant General Javed Nasir, following allegations of his involvement in 1993 Mumbai bombing, in which 257 civilians were killed and 713 wounded. This is Shuja Nawaz, a Pakistani. In December 2001, Pakistan Railway Minister, earlier again DGISI, please note, Lieutenant General Javed Ashraf Qazi, admitted in Pakistan Parliament in March 2004 that the attack on the Indian Parliament in December 2001 was carried out by Bhawalpur-based Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Maulana Masood Azhar in the Pakistan Parliament. The third, and then I'd see this, but you see I'm an Indian, so you'll make a slight concession for me. The Joint Chairman, Chiefs of Staff Committee, Admiral Mike Mullen, in September 2011, has said that extremist organizations serving as proxies of the government of Pakistan are attacking Afghan and US soldiers as well as civilians, and the Haqqani network was acting as a strategic arm. Somewhere he said a veritable ally of the Pakistan ISI, Mike Mullen. Last, and this happened only last month, where the Minister of Climate Change in Pakistan, Mushaidullah Khan, he is from the same party as the Prime Minister, Muslim League Nawaz, claimed that the ISI plotted to topple civil and military leadership during protests last year. This is the Imran Khan and Tahir Qadir duo. The IB had intercepted calls by former ISI chief, Lieutenant General Zahirullah Islam. And this was recorded, and they have the taped version of this conversation. My conclusion. My first point I want to make is that the Pakistan army has lost more soldiers fighting terrorism that it has created itself than it has in all the wars it has fought with India or on its western borders. That's the first point. The second point is that the US's fatal obsession with Pakistan may end after Afghanistan's withdrawal. Now, if the Americans withdraw, then who will replace the Americans? The Chinese. They have this all-weather friendship with China. They describe it as deep as the ocean, as high as the Karakorams, as strong as steel, as sweet as sugar, as precious as ice, as sweet as honey. This is the China-Pakistan relationship that the Pakistanis are hoping to make friends with. And the last but one point is that the US has to banish the flawed belief that Pakistan can be a force of any good to anybody. And therefore, Pakistan's policy towards India is congenital, pathological enmity of India, and this will not change. Because it is not a military conflict, it is an ideological conflict. And so my recommendations are 3. So how do we change Pakistan? Or at least attempt to change Pakistan? To make it a normal state. First, with all the evidence that I have cited, and which is available with the United States, they have reams and reams and reams of evidence. The United Nations and other European powers, Pakistan should be declared a state in violation of its obligations under the UN Charter, Conventions on Terrorism. That's the first. Following due process, it be declared a state harboring, sponsoring terrorists, funding terrorists, and maintaining full-fledged structures and infrastructure of terrorists. And the final thing is the question that I would like to ask, people ask, a lot of Indians ask, is why is it the United States does not act against Pakistan? Why is it that the United States has given such a long rope to Pakistan? What will it take on Pakistan's part that it must do or that it might do which will force the US to respond? And finally, very finally, before you show me stop, in order to bleed India, Pakistan is bleeding itself. And with it, the Talibanization of Pakistan is moving full speed ahead. So help us God.
Thank you, General, for this very vivid presentation. And I'm one of the few Israelis which considers indeed the Pakistani threat perhaps more not existential but serious than the Iranian ones because exactly of the nuclear umbrella and the ideology of the army and of the intelligence. And by the way, when we speak about nuclear terrorism, there is a lot of discussion in academic and even practitioners about the threat of nuclear terrorism. If there is a threat of nuclear terrorism, it's not radiological. The nuclear, it's only in Pakistan. Only the failure of the Pakistanis to control their weapons or the control that some of the terrorist organizations can take of nuclear facilities is indeed a nuclear threat. Now, speaking about the Pakistani interference in Afghanistan, we have Mr. Jonathan Paris, which is Associate Fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalisation at King's College in London. He is a senior advisor with the Chertoff Group in Washington, and he is interested in a lot of issues concerning Middle East, South Asia, Africa, China, Europe, counter-radicalization, and international security. And he was editing 2 monographs, the Prospects for Pakistan and Prospects for Iran, and co-authored Beyond Sectarianism, Geopolitics, Fragmentation, and the Syrian Civil War. Jonathan,
Thank you very much, Eli. We're going to try to catch up a little bit. We've got a little bit behind, I think. So I'm going to try to keep this. Eli, put the 3-minute thing up at 10. so that we can, because I wanted to have a little shot on Iran and what you're going to say about Saudi and Turkey in the Q&A. I'm like the everything bagel, you know? I do everything, okay? A little bit of everything.
The internet doesn't work.
Is that it? Yes.
Yeah, it's
so that's the first one, okay.
Yeah, the internet doesn't work.
So how do I go to the second one?
So just click when you're ready, click escape, and then...
How do you go to the second one?
And then, on the thing, I'll show you. But when you want the thing, click escape, and then it's the little, the
I'll
Adobe.
tell you what, you stay here.
Oh, God.
We're just going to show you a couple of maps real quickly. Okay, that's map one. Why don't you show us the second map?
Okay.
Can't do that. Oh, does this go down? And...
You just click.
Just four maps.
Oh, I'm terrible, Vanna.
While she's doing that, I'll start the speech. First of all...
use a microphone, Jonathan.
Huh? Oh, you want me to speak in here? Okay. Just... This multimedia. Just watch this. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is the map that shows you Afghanistan and Pakistan in the context of the Middle East. Iran's there, India's there, and you've got Central Asia. So this is a pretty good map for this session because it connects the themes that we've been talking about earlier in this session. The next map. This one I like because General Ashok was talking a lot about Kashmir. You know, Kashmir is sort of like the Palestinian issue. It's a fundamental clash from the inception of the two states. And you can see where Kashmir is. And notice how close Kashmir is to the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad. But you also see how close Afghanistan is to Kashmir. So a lot of the jihadis fighting in Afghanistan can also fight in Kashmir. And the final map is a cartoon, actually. There we go. So this is a picture of, looks like a U.S. soldier grabbing and choking a Pakistani. This is sort of how the Pakistani public sees Afghanistan. So there we are. Well, why don't we just, do you have the map with the link on?
Yeah, do you want me to?
Yeah, leave that one on, the one with the link.
There's no internet.
Oh, there's no... Okay, then you could just go to the first map you showed, the one that showed Iran, the second one there. I would argue that there are three goals of Pakistan in Afghanistan. The first interest is to counter what's called Pashtunland. This is the border that's on both sides. You have ethnic Pashtun, and there was always a fear in Pakistan that the ethnic Pashtun on the Afghanistan side of the border would consolidate with the ethnic Pashtun on the Pakistan side of the border and create an independent state. That's the first Pakistani interest in Afghanistan, is to block that, and that started quite a long time ago under the rule of Ali Bhutto. The second goal is to have a proxy. And here, I used to say, think of Hezbollah, but after hearing the two talks here, you can't call Hezbollah the Iranian proxy anymore. It's a symbiotic relationship, or it's what do you call it, a Foreign Legion, senior member of the Foreign Legion. But whatever it is, I think Pakistan does have a proxy using the Afghan Taliban in Afghanistan. And of course, the third goal of Pakistan and Afghanistan shouldn't surprise you, is to counter India. Pakistan has, as General Ashok said, made and continues to make a distinction between the bad Taliban in Pakistan that targets Pakistan military and civilians. They're the ones that Pakistan wants to get rid of. And the good Taliban in Afghanistan that targets Afghan military and civilians, and wherever possible, U.S. and other Western advisors still in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis in the Northwest Territories see their ethnic Pashtun cousins across the border as a natural ethnic ally against the less friendly Northern Alliance and other ethnic Afghan troops. Pakistan has always maintained the strategic doctrine of having a weak central Afghan rule over territories near the Pakistan border. This provides Pakistan, at least according to their thinking, with strategic depth from any possible India-Afghan alliance. One of the byproducts of the Mujahideen war against the Soviets in the 80s was not only the incubation of al-Qaeda and the ideology of Islamic Jihad, but the sponsorship by Pakistan of terrorism in Afghanistan. Now, just a quick historical footnote. How did I get to Pakistan? After all, I basically am a Middle East analyst. I came here 49 years ago and started following Nasser and the Arab-Israeli conflict. So where does Pakistan come in? Well, I got there because I moved to London a few months. I left New York a few months before 9/11, moved to London, but I didn't get to Pakistan through the more traditional route, which is the India-Pakistan diet. I didn't get there either through the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan after 9/11. No, it was during my encounter with counterterrorism in London, before and especially after 7/7/2005, that was London's 9/11, that I noted the preponderance of ethnic Pakistanis in the Muslim community in the United Kingdom. So it was fortuitous for me that I became interested in Pakistan politics just as the Musharraf government began to lose its grip, culminating in the monograph that Ellie mentioned, The Prospects for Pakistan. And my conclusion in that monograph was and remains that Pakistan is not a failed state, that Pakistan will somehow muddle through. Now, the conventional wisdom in the West is that Pakistan, like several countries in the Arab world and in Africa, is a failed state. Even worse, it's a failed nuclear state. But let's be clear, the kind of failed state that we're seeing in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya, in Somalia, in the Central African Republic, is nowhere near close to the reality in Pakistan. President Zardari, the ex-president, who was elected to power in the aftermath of the assassination of his wife, Benazir Bhutto, actually served out his term without the removal by the military, and this is only the second time that that's happened, that there hasn't been a military coup throwing out the civilian leader. The first time, parenthetically, was when Benazir Bhutto's father, Ali Bhutto, won his re-election only to be tossed out by a military man, Zia al-Haq, the one with the funny mustache, and then later executed by al-Haq. He was actually executed. But the point here I'm saying is that Pakistan has had loads of problems ever since its inception, but it has always somehow muddled through. It is not anywhere close to what we're seeing in the Middle East meltdown. There is a state, there is an army. Those nukes that we're worried about are under control of the army. I don't see any likelihood, at least in the short term, of the wrong people getting their hands on those nukes. But that's a parenthetical. Now, Pakistan politics may be dysfunctional, and it's military manipulative, with an obsession with the threat from the much larger India, nurtured by historic grievances over Kashmir. I can't underestimate that, those grievances over Kashmir. But Pakistan is not a failed state. Its economy is not doing too badly, and and they are actually benefiting more than most by the low energy prices, because they're a big importer of energy. So then why does Pakistan seek to make mayhem in Afghanistan at this particular juncture? Why does it allow madrasas in the Northwest Territories to churn out hundreds and even thousands of Islamic zealots willing to blow themselves up across the border? Why can't Pakistan shut down the so-called Haqqani network that wreaked havoc on so many Americans? Personal footnote, my son served in a SEALs unit as an intelligence officer for 2 tours in the Zabul province, which is currently, by the way, the location right now of a shootout between the Afghan Taliban leaders, troops, the new Mullah named Mullah Mansour, and those other Afghan Taliban who refuse to accept Mullah Mansour as their leader. So right now, in the very same place where my son served, Pakistan's hidden hand in Afghanistan, in my view, is not so hidden. As General Ashok made it very clear, it's got their, to use Matt's favorite term, fingerprints. But when you speak to the political elite from Pakistan, and I do, because living in London, you run into a lot of these people, even former prime ministers, you hear the same argument. Why does India have 6 or 8 consulates in Afghanistan? Why do they need all of these consulates, they say, when they barely have that many construction workers in Afghanistan? The implication is that India is embedded in Afghanistan intel. India intel is working, which is called, by the way, RAW, or raw, like raw meat. Raw is the counterpart of ISI. So the narrative among these people is that RAW is embedded in and working very closely with Afghan intelligence, and in particular with the Northern Alliance. That's the group, the faction, the co-president, if you will, or CEO of Afghanistan is from the Northern Alliance. They are not Pashtun, and they have been historically anti-Pakistan. By the way, just a footnote. Pakistan and Afghanistan had good relations only once in the 62-year history of Pakistan, and that was, believe it or not, during the 1994 to 2001 period when Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban. The Kabul attacks, I want to just comment on that because that was one of the reasons why I was chosen to be the number 2 speaker on India-Pakistan, sort of like Matt Levitt being the number 2 speaker on Iran. And that was because Ellie had pointed out to me that
every main act,
There's no number 2 here.
every main act needs
I'm not number 1. I'm number 2. I'm number 2. Excuse me, you're using up my time. I'm trying to gain time, and you're trying to lose time. No, I'm Mavis. It's already 3 minutes. All right, okay. I'll go sit down now. Now, I know all of you will want to hear about Saudi Arabia and Turkey and all that, and so do I. So I'm really going to try to wrap it up here. But there was this kind of period where Pakistan and Afghanistan looked like they were working together to bring the Afghan Taliban to the negotiating table with the new president of Afghanistan. He seems like a good guy, Mr. Ghani, and there was this sort of good feeling going on. And then all of a sudden, you've got these terrorist attacks in Kabul and elsewhere in Afghanistan. And, it definitely has the footprints of the Haqqani network or other networks, or perhaps Mullah Mansour himself, who's based in Pakistan, going across the border and creating havoc. And, what caused all this? Well, perhaps it was the bombshell that some of you may remember over the summer that Mullah Omar had not only died, but he had died a couple of years ago, and they had kept it secret. Now the succession struggle within the Afghan Taliban became public, and the anointed leader presumably wants to show his toughness to those within his organization by initiating these attacks. Note that the Afghan Taliban Shura is based in Quetta, Balochistan, which is in southwestern Pakistan, and the Haqqani network is based in North Waziristan in northwest Pakistan. One analyst recently pointed out, actually it was yesterday in the Foreign Policy, that the Afghan President Ghani cannot afford to disregard the troubling reality that while Pakistan promised to deliver the Afghan Taliban to the negotiating table and to dampen the violent levels in Afghanistan, Islamabad simply cannot provide results. It cannot deliver. After Kabul's bloodiest month on record, Ghani has reversed his earlier calls for a rapprochement with Pakistan, so we're back to square one. And I think this is very sad, but I think this is part of what General Ashok is trying to say. There's this endemic problem of Pakistan and its ISI and its whole fixation on Afghanistan. So I would just wrap it up by just saying one other comment, which is the IS. As many of you have read, the IS has a presence in Pakistan and Afghanistan now. The question is the IS really as big of a threat as the Afghan Taliban? And I would say that we have to be leery here to kind of extrapolate from Raqqa to Mosul to Kashmir. It doesn't work that way. What you're seeing is some of the people in the Afghan Taliban are disgruntled, and some of them have pledged allegiance to IS, but it's not a huge number. And so the argument that, hey, we better, make peace with the Afghan Taliban now because what will come, after is much worse. Sort of like we better make peace with Hamas because if we don't, the Salafist, the future IS in Gaza will take over. I don't think that is a correct way to look at it, because the fact of the matter is that the Afghan Taliban have killed more civilians and Afghan military people in 2014 than any other year on record, and 2015 looks like it's going to surpass that record. So let's keep the balance in mind that while it is true that both India and Pakistan are concerned about the growth of IS in their areas, it appears that not more than a modest number of disgruntled Afghan Taliban have pledged allegiance to the IS. Perhaps that number will grow as a result of this new succession. Not everybody's happy with the new successor, but it doesn't make IS more of a threat than the Afghan Taliban. And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And this is indeed a very interesting issue if the IS or SIS will prevail or will be embedded seriously in Afghanistan and Pakistan, how the ISI, the Pakistani ISI, will see them good terrorists or bad terrorists. How will be the relationship with them? Now we have a new players as state sponsors in the Middle East on the background of the wars in Syria and Iraq, and these are Turkey and Qatar. And we'll have Dr. Jonathan Schanzer speaking about Turkey and Qatar as emerging state sponsors of terror. Dr. Schanzer is Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington. He's part of the leadership team of the foundation, which deals with sanctions and illicit finance. And previously, he worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the United States Department of the Treasury and a former research fellow at the Washington Institute, together with Matt. And I had the honor to be there also. Please, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Eli, and it's a pleasure to speak with you all today. A pleasure to be on the panel with my distinguished colleagues. I can't help but to think about what this region must sound like. Thinking about all the various messes that we're trying to unpack for you, I'm reminded of the old joke that. Moses, for those of you who know the biblical history, that Moses was deaf, and when God told him to take the Jews to Canada, he heard Canaan, and the rest was history. And so, in keeping with that theme, we're gonna unpack a few other bad actors in the Middle East. What's that?
Stop the ring. God asked him where you want to go. He said, car. And then he said, I know.
Oh, yes. Well, I shortened it a little bit. We're tight on time today, as you all know. Yeah. So you've heard about the blue chips. You've heard about the state sponsors of terrorism, the ones that we all know. From Pakistan, you'll hear about Saudi Arabia in a little bit, of course, Iran and its prize proxy, Hezbollah. What I want to look at today are emerging state sponsors. These are the countries of Qatar and Turkey. This is decidedly awkward to talk about in Washington, where I work. It's also awkward to talk about it here in Israel, where our policies are a bit ambivalent. We work in the United States with the Qataris and the Turks on crucial national security issues, and the Israelis do as well. Did and now are again, and we can talk about that shortly. But let me just start for just a moment. I think it's probably worth, everybody's been hearing a lot about how the Iran deal is going to impact Hamas. In short, we don't know how the Iran deal is going to impact Hamas because Iran and Hamas have been, the term in Hebrew is broges. They've been in a fight for quite some time about the Syrian civil war. And what we saw is that when Iran ultimately pulled its funding from Hamas back in roughly 2012. It was Mohammed Morsi from Egypt who filled the void for some time, and that the cash and weapons were coming through the tunnels. Those tunnels have since been destroyed by Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the new leader in Egypt, who is on very good terms with the Israelis and has basically joined hands in destroying Hamas's pipeline. And so as the pipelines began to dry up, we began to see a new phenomenon, and that is strong support from two countries for Hamas, and that is Turkey and Qatar. They are the patrons of the Muslim Brotherhood worldwide. And so this is in keeping with that. Hamas is, of course, a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so let me just briefly try to go through what we see there before moving on to some of the other portfolios that these two countries have. So we'll start with Turkey. I think we all probably remember the moment that we all realized that Turkey was a sponsor of Hamas. And this was the 2010 flotilla, where the group that was involved in trying to break the blockade of the Gaza Strip, the legal blockade of the Gaza Strip, was called the IHH. This is an organization that is part of a broader charity that both Matt and I looked at when we were at the Treasury Department, called the Union of Good. The Union of Good is a Qardawi charity that is a sponsor of Hamas, has been designated by the U.S. Treasury. And so for those who were aware of the IHH and its position within that matrix, it became very clear who we were dealing with. And then when you looked at the IHH's connections to the AKP government in Turkey and Ankara, it became even more clear that this was a state-sponsored group. Now, for those who kept watching the Turkey-Hamas relationship, as I did after 2010, one name that came up time and again is a name that should be, I think, well known to everyone in this room, and that is Saleh Arouri. For those of you who are not familiar with that name, it'll become clear in a moment that if you recall, the person who took credit for the kidnapping and killing of those 3 teens last summer in the West Bank, the one who took credit in front of 1,000 Islamic figures in Istanbul, his name was Saleh Arouri. He is the leader of the Qassam brigades in the West Bank. He was sent to Turkey in advance of the Gilad Shalit prisoner swap as a measure of good faith, and he's been operating there ever since. Now, Arouri, I think, is largely responsible for the war that took place last summer. And I think he would probably say so himself somewhat proudly. But apart from Arouri, we have seen other figures that have also found a home in Turkey. We believe that there are more than 24 individuals that are now based in Turkey or have made their home in Turkey until very recently, making Turkey the largest external headquarters for Hamas outside of the Gaza Strip. This is significant for a NATO country. Of course. We saw the presence of Imad al-Alami. This is the traditional envoy between Hamas and Iran, the man responsible for bringing in Iranian weapons and cash and training to Hamas. He was based in Turkey until recently. We don't know if he's still there. 2 money men, one named Bakri Hanifa, another one named Maher Ubaid. Both of them have been based in Turkey, are very openly on Facebook, and you can find them. They're flaunting the fact that they're there, and they're thanking the Turks for the opportunity to wage jihad from their soil. Other Shalit deal prisoner swap individuals, Mahmoud Atun, Taysir Soleimani, we've seen a number of these people in and out, and they're on TV in Turkey talking about their jihadi martyr operations and the like. There have been multiple reports of weapons training, of cash coming from the Turks themselves, upwards of $100 million, which of course pales in comparison to the billions that we're seeing right now from Iran, but nevertheless significant funds for an organization like Hamas. The only question that we have right now, it gets back to the question of Arouri, the senior leader of this group. There are reports in the Israeli press as well as the Turkish press that he may have been forced out as a result of American pressure and Israeli pressure. There could be a moment where Turkey turns the tide on this. We're still not sure. But in the meantime, you have Qatar also providing significant support to Hamas. This is the ATM of Hamas, as we like to say. Everybody recalls in 2012 when Sheikh Hamad, the former emir of Qatar, traveled to Hamas-controlled Gaza. He was the first world leader to go to the Gaza Strip after the Hamas takeover in 2007, and he pledged $400 million to Hamas very openly on television. Khalid Meshal, the head of the Politburo of Hamas, is based in Doha. And I was actually amazed just the other day, 2 days ago. I'm sitting in the ICT conference, and I'm looking on Twitter, and I see that there is a tweet from Izzat Reshek, who is another person who is based in Doha. He's the spokesman for Hamas, and he's got an Arabic sort of PDF. And it's an invitation, and I open up the invitation in Arabic. It says that Khalid Meshal is going to have a press conference at the Four Seasons Hotel in Doha. And this is how openly Hamas operates in Qatar. It is a remarkable phenomenon of how this happens. And of course, this is a U.S. ally. This is the place where the U.S. has its largest forward air base in the Middle East, Al Udeid, and the Four Seasons is only several miles away from it. The dissonance is rather deafening. And so we've seen Shalit prisoners there as well, operatives like Hussam Badran from the West Bank. There's been some talk that perhaps the new emir, Tamim, might bring some change and that Qatar might not have as hospitable of a territory to work from, although I think that at this point we have not seen that in the least. In keeping with the Brotherhood activity, we have seen also from Qatar and Turkey support for the ongoing war in Libya. This has not gotten a lot of attention at all in the United States. When I read the Israeli press, I don't see it as well. But of course, Libya is in the throes of a rather nasty civil war. There are Islamist factions working against an internationally recognized government in Tobruk. The Fajr coalition, as it is known, is a patchwork of Islamist factions. They are receiving significant funds from the Qataris and the Turks. It is an ongoing process. And in fact, what we saw the other day, I don't know if anybody saw in the press, but there was a shipment of weapons that was stopped by the Greeks. 5,000 shotguns, 500,000 rounds of ammunition, all sent from Turkey to the Islamists. Now, the debate, of course, is whether this was going to the Fajr coalition, to the Islamists there, or whether it was going to the Islamic State. Now, we leave that up to the journalists to figure that out. But again, some very troubling indicators from both countries, Qatar and Turkey, about their support for these factions. Now, a lot of people will ask, how did this come about? I mean, part of it has to do with the use of the Muslim Brotherhood to project power in the region. But when one looks at Qatar in particular, this should not be a surprise. For those who are aware of their 9/11 history, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the planner of the 9/11 attacks, had been based in Qatar with the full knowledge of the Qatari government. And of course, we also have a Taliban office that is based in Doha now. It's remarkable. And this was the office that was used to negotiate the release of Bo Bergdahl, the American deserter, in exchange for Taliban prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. I had an opportunity to visit Qatar not long ago, and I was talking to one of the expats there who told me this incredibly wild story. First of all, he said that Khalid Meshal, everybody sees him walking around in Doha, and the joke is like it's the way that people from Manhattan can spot Woody Allen. That this is sort of you see the Meshal sighting, but with the Taliban, it was even more remarkable. There was an opening of an IKEA furniture store. And so my friend is there, and he sees a Taliban guy standing next to an American serviceman, eyeing the same couch that they wanted to buy for their apartments. I mean, this is Qatar for you, right? This sums up Qatar in really, really wild.
Tell me there was only one left.
I don't know, but the fight would have been interesting, right? IEDs under the seats or something. So anyway, moving on to other fronts where both of these actors are involved. Syria. We see a huge fingerprint, footprint. We keep having the debate today. I don't know what it is. Look, both countries are justifiably upset about what's going on in Syria right now. They look at the mass slaughter of their fellow co-religionists, the Sunnis that are being slaughtered in Syria right now. But the way that they have gone about trying to change the equation there is utterly despicable. We've seen a huge amount of support from both Turkey and Qatar to a range of jihadi fighters. Now, they will not admit that they are funding the Nusra Front or ISIS. I can tell you, based on conversations that I've had with senior U.S. government officials, that the Nusra Front, it is guaranteed that funding and arms and weapons and training are going to the Nusra Front from both countries. In Qatar, for example, they hosted Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, the head of the Nusra Front. They brought him to Doha in the same way that they have the Taliban figures and Hamas figures as well. The Treasury has designated Qataris over and over again for support to the Nusra Front in Syria. We see the color that is provided through the declassified intelligence that the Treasury provides. And it was Undersecretary of Treasury David Cohen who called Qatar among the most permissive terror finance environments, particularly when it comes to this issue. Turkey is no better. Turkey, we see along its 565-mile border. It is a zone of terror finance activity unlike anything that I've seen probably since Afghanistan and Pakistan. That the amount of weapons and cash and fighters that cross over this border to join the jihad in Syria with the full knowledge of the Turkish army, the full knowledge of the Turkish intelligence, the MIT, and one only has to take a look at when people want to join the jihad from the West. Right? We've seen it from Chicago and from Minneapolis and other places around the United States. What's the one thing that these people do when they want to join the fight? They get a one-way ticket to where? To Istanbul. And from there, they make their way out east, and they spend $25 to cross the border, and all they need is a Kalashnikov and a beard, and they're ready to fight. And so we see a lot of traffic going from Turkey in, but we also see the sale of oil from ISIS-controlled territory. We also see the sale of antiquities from ISIS-controlled territory. These are huge money makers. And so it has become incredibly frustrating for Western policymakers as they try to battle this phenomenon. A final note on Turkey before I get to wrap up. I'm getting the hook. One is the last thing is that on Turkey we've also seen a significant amount of activity with Iran. Now, of course, Iran is almost not a state sponsor of terrorism anymore, the way that it's being described in the West, which is frustrating in and of itself. But at the moment when we had the most amount of pressure on the Iranians, when the sanctions were supposed to, I don't know how to say the word uncle in Farsi, but that's what it was meant to get the Iranians to say. What we saw instead was a sanctions-busting regime employed by the Turks. In one case, it was called Gas for Gold, which yielded Iran roughly $13 billion at the height of the sanctions regime. And then on top of that, we saw $100 billion in illicit financial activity detailed in a corruption report released by the Istanbul prosecutor. So we're talking about $113 billion in sanctions busting that took place with the full knowledge of the Turks, in some cases enriching Turkish leaders. And it all went to benefit Iran at the moment that we had them potentially on the ropes with the sanctions regime. So in short, we're not dealing with very nice actors here. The initial description of these actors was that they had these regional ambitions, and that they were trying to promote the brotherhood, and they were trying to promote themselves amidst the Arab Spring. And now we're hearing that because the Arab Spring has largely petered out and that their ambitions have failed them, that they may be changing. I am not sure. And we've heard about some of the Sunni actors and Shia actors in the region. My sense is that both of these countries still seek to use Sunni jihadism as a means to extend their influence, but also potentially to counter Iranian influence as well. I think part of the other problem that I think we can point to is that the United States has not had, I hate to use the term, but red lines. We have not been able to dictate to the Qataris or the Turks what it is that they do that is acceptable and when that it is not. And it doesn't make it any easier that we have these very valuable military assets in these countries, sometimes right around the corner from where the illicit activity is taking place. And that actually brings me to when we talk about answers. one answer may be that we need to begin to rethink our air bases, right? This is the same aspect that we have with the Pakistani problem, that we're so intricately tied with these regimes and they're bad actors. It's hard to pull away because they're so vital to us on certain issues. We tend to ignore things when they go against our interests. But in the end, what we're looking at are two countries that are I think it's probably too soon to call them full-on state sponsors of terrorism, but they're not friends. They're not quite enemies. In Washington, we call them frenemies, and we'd like to change that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. One moment, I'll put my... Where is it? Okay, I forgot to present myself, so I think that by now everybody knows that my name is Eli and that I'm a researcher at ICT, so I think it's sufficient. I intended to speak at this panel about Turkey and Qatar, but Jonathan stole my subject, so I had to decide another subject, and because I'm looking to what happens in Syria for the last 3-4 years and Iraq, I have more and more questions than answers. And one of the questions is, who is exactly a terrorist organization? How do you recognize terrorist organizations from a freedom fighter? Always there was this problem between the freedom fighters and the terrorist organizations. And here, clearly, the situation is so complicated, so complex, that we have to think, indeed, who is supporting this organization and why they are considered to be, because they are fighting the ISIS or because they are fighting the Bashar regime, they are considered to be legitimate organizations. Now, when we look to the United States State Department list, the last list of 2014, we see that who is on the list? Hezbollah, Hamas, if we speak about Syria, they are fighting the Yarmouk, they fought in the Yarmouk camp against ISIS. We see the PFLP General Command, which is still on the list. Then we'll see Al-Qaeda, but lately we heard mainly about the Khorasan group, which is active in Syria, and they were bombed by the United States. We see that Islamic State of Iraq, by the way, is there since 2004, and the Nusra Front in 2014. Now, we have the Kurdish Western Workers' Party from 1997, and in Iraq we have the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the new Al-Qaeda, and Kataib Hezbollah. That's all the list of the State Department. So indeed this is the complete list. And if we look to what is said about Iran activity, terrorist activity, by the way, this year the list was much more comprehensive than the last year because there was the negotiations. But now Iran continued in Syria to provide arms, financing, training, and the facilitation of primarily Iraqi Shia and Afghan fighters to support the Assad regime's brutal crackdown. In Iraq, Iran increased training and funding to Iraqi Shia militia groups in response to ISIL's advance into Iraq. Many of those groups, such as Kataib Hezbollah, the only one which is here mentioned, have exacerbated sectarian tensions in Iraq and had committed serious human rights abuses against primarily Sunni civilians. So we see that this is a very, very short description of what the Iranians are doing in the region. If we look to the Shia-Alawi coalition, we see that indeed Hezbollah is the main power, but if we look to the flags of the IRGC on the one hand, the left one, and the right one, the Hezbollah, they are indeed global players, like was said by Ilan. They are global players not only on the political level, but clearly with the struggle of the Kalashnikov, they are ready to act, including in supporting oppressed people all over the world. About the Iraqi groups, here you have most important groups which are active since 2012 in Syria. And by the way, the pretext for their participation in the fight was to defend the Zainab holy shrine near Damascus. But we know that they are practically, together with Hezbollah, very effective and very important in the fight in the Kalamun Mountains and even in the northern Aleppo region. And they actually, together with the Hezbollah and the support clearly of the Iranians, were responsible for the survival of the regime, and otherwise I think the regime were not able to survive. And lately we saw that there is even an Afghani battalion. There are most of them Shiites. They are under direct command of Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, and their commander was killed several months ago, but they continue to fight there. They are trained, financed, and directed different operationally by the Iranians. If you look more in detail, you see that there are at least, 2, 4, 6, 14 organizations. Most of them still fighting in Syria, although some of them returned to Iraq because they had to fight the ISIS. When you look to other paramilitary organizations, you see a lot of Palestinian ex-groups like the General Command of the PFLP, but also here Liwa al-Quds al-Palestine, Palestinian Liberation Army. Even you have a Christian organization, Sotoro. You have Jaish al-Wafa, a lot of organizations which nobody is exactly considering to be terrorist organizations. Sorry, I don't know why. There is a problem, like with technology. Now, the Sunni coalition, at the beginning, you see by mid-2012, a researcher considered that this is the map of the Islamist organization. You have Sukur al-Sham, you have the Ummah Brigade, Jabh al-Nusra already present there, Ahrar al-Sham, by the way, one of the very important organizations, Fatah al-Islam, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Abdul Azam. That's all in the middle of the 2012. But by the end of 2012, you see a first Islamist coalition fighting the regime, which included 11 organizations at the beginning, and then a kind of coalition inside the coalition, 7 organizations, part of them in the southern Syria, part of them in the region of Aleppo. And if you look to the details, you see an example, for instance, in the Idlib governorate, how they are acting in various neighborhoods, in various villages near the city. So it's a kind of cosmos of, if you want, organizations and groups, depending on people which are living in the region. And in the case of Idlib, you see here, you have here the numbers. And while many groups have joined this loose connection of fighters, others, including more Islamist-leaning organizations, have not. And this is the problem. Who is the coalition with whom? Because these coalitions are changing every month. Every 2 months, there is a change, and nobody knows exactly to what organization they will depend. In September 2013, you see the first big coalition, 11 organizations, including Jabh al-Nusra, and ISIS, together to all the moderate Islamists. Why? This is the result, practically, of the American-Russian agreement on the chemical dismantling of chemical facilities in Syria, but at the same time permitting the survival of the al-Bashar regime. And this coalition was the result of the frustration after Obama promised to bomb the Syrian army and did nothing. But all of a sudden, 2 months later, in November, another coalition, the Islamic Front. You see how they changed completely. Why? Because Saudi Arabia changed their policy. Most of these organizations were supported by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, the 3 of them. Because one of the problems that we had in this conflict is the United States and Europe have outsourcing their involvement to the regional powers. And first of all, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, everyone with different players or proxies, if you want, with different strategic interests. So Saudi Arabia, by the end of, the middle of 2013, arrives at the conclusion that this is a threat to its own internal strategic interests. So they decide to form a new Islamist moderate group, the Islamic Front, which, by the way, was not so successful, and they promote internal legislation much more serious than in Europe or in the United States. No preaching in the mosque, no financing, and no right to fight outside Saudi Arabia. But if you look again, what happens on the Syrian front? Armed opposition groups, which are in the northern Syria, you see how many organizations are active there and who is exactly supporting. You here have the Levant front, another one. Now, when you look to these organizations, you see the various ones. In the Homs region, you see how many organizations. You see in the southern front, how many groups are there? And this is not all, because these are the main, those who share her name. But behind or below this, you have hundreds of groups. Every village, every neighborhood has a leader. Either a Hamula leader, a tribal leader, a charismatic leader, and he is trying to achieve resources, weapons, and financing. And this is how he decides to whom make an alliance. Now here you have, again, in the operations rooms, the operational rooms of these organizations. Jabhat al-Nusra is only one of them. You have 2, 4, 7, 8, 10. Jabhat al-Nusra is only one of them, but it's very successful. Now you have suspected Islamic State affiliates in southern Syria. Some of those decided that perhaps the Islamic State is, after conquering especially Palmyra, is the winner. So